I'm Seth Meyers. This late night. We hope you're doing well. And now, if you don't mind, I'm going to get to the news. President Trump spoke tonight before a joint session of Congress. We don't know how it went, but apparently Marco Rubio has sunk even further into the couch. Fox News on Sunday published an op-ed written by Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. It's titled, "Measles Are Just God's Freckles." President Trump is reportedly focused on winning a Nobel Peace Prize for ending the war in Ukraine. I hope he can attend the ceremony, but he's going to be pretty busy with his war in Canada. The Los Angeles grocery store chain Erewhon is facing criticism for offering a single strawberry for $19, or for the same price, they'll let you look at an egg. Domino's Pizza has launched the chain's first stuffed crust pizza, and it might be a big seller because apparently it's stuffed with better pizza. Delta Airlines has reportedly offered passengers on the flight that crash-landed in Toronto $30,000 each, or in airport terms, a large water and 2 bananas. And finally, the second annual Florida Man Games were held over the weekend outside St. Augustine. Sadly, several contestants were disqualified for testing negative for meth. That was a monologue. We are off and running, you guys. We've got a great show for you tonight. Our first guest. He's an Emmy and Grammy-nominated comedian. You've seen in so many of the best shows like Portlandia, SNL, Wednesday, and more. He's also an amazing musician who led the 8G band here at Late Night for 10 years. So excited to have my friend back on the show. Fred Armisen is here tonight, everybody. How about that? You know her from films such as Blink Twice, I Want to Dance with Somebody, and Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker. Currently, she's starring in Mickey 17, which is in theaters this weekend. Naomi Ackie will also be joining us, everybody. She is the articles editor of The New Yorker and the former editor-in-chief of The New York Observer. Her new book, it's fantastic. Lorne, the man who invented Saturday Night Live, is out now. Susan Morrison will be stopping by. Couple of episodes of family trips to listen to. We did Bill Gates. There was Bill Gates and Wendy McClendon-Covey. That's me and my brother do a podcast. Check it out. It's very fun. You guys, we here at Late Night don't always have enough time to cover all of the recent news. So here with a recap is one of our writers, Amber Ruffin, in a segment we call Amber Says What.
You guys, things have been crazy. First of all, last month was Black History Month, and I was like, what? We're still having those? Oh, that was the last one? Well, not a bad one to go out on, because Beyonce won a Grammy for Best Country Album, and I was like, what? Then she won a Grammy for Best Album, and I was like, what? But Beyonce was like, what? Then I heard Trump rename the Gulf of Mexico, and I was like, what did he change it to? Gulf of America? Boring. And now's the time to steal the name Zanzibar. It's the best name on the planet. We should have it. Then I saw he banned the Associated Press from the Oval Office because they kept saying Gulf of Mexico. And I was like, what? Now you care about dead naming? Fine. Well, I'm going to start renaming stuff too.
You can't do that.
Shut up, Amber Jr. Oh. Because you're my little baby. Then all the social media pages for Duolingo were saying that its owl mascot had died, and I was like, what? What would you do this for? Duolingo, we do not have the space for this. We simply do not. As a Duolingo user, I have to say this. Yamete kudasai. Watashi no jinsei wa kono mama debo jubun ni kibishi desu. Then I found out there's a new hell, and it's the sky. There have been all kinds of airplane mishaps. First, a plane filled with smoke and had to make an emergency landing, and I was like, what? Then a plane landed upside down, and I was like, what? Then I read about a new fresh hell. A person died on an airplane, and a couple had to sit next to the dead body for 4 hours. I was like, what? Let me tell you something. If I'm on a plane next to a dead body, that will not be the only dead body on that plane. I will also pass. I will take her hand and I will pass right along with her. We are already halfway to heaven. There's no reason not to. Then I read because of climate change, orcas have started hunting narwhals. And I was like, what? Not narwhals, they're the unicorns of the sea. Then one scientist described narwhals as slow, chubby, and delicious. And I was like, what? Narwhals are my type? Yeah, I can see it. Then I heard there was news about Rudy Giuliani, and I was like, what kind of hilarious news is it now? I read on and it was like he was at a Walmart. I was like, that's not it. Then it was like he was in a little jazzy scooter. I was like, that's not it. Then it was like he was shopping for hair dye, and I was like, there it is. This man exists solely for my amusement and oppression. Then I read that people are rubbing banana peels on their faces instead of getting Botox. And I was like, what? That's like people are eating pizza instead of doing long division. How are the two things connected? Also, people will try anything, won't they, Seth? Seth Meyers, did it work?
I don't know yet.
Keep me posted.
Okay.
Then I saw that eggs are getting more expensive, and I was like, what? I hate it. But then I saw bodegas in New York City are selling individual eggs like Lucy cigarettes, and I was like, what? I love it! What would we do without bodegas? You need cheese at 2 a.m., bodega. You need exactly 3 tampons, bodega. You need a sandwich, a book of matches, and some Windex at the same time. Say it with me, bodega. Bodegas are America's true problem solvers. Everyone else is wasting my time. Didn't think you guys would shout bodega like that, but it made me feel good. Then I saw the craziest video of a kayaker being swallowed by a freaking whale and then spit back out. Look at it.
Hey! Ya, vente, vente!
I saw that and I was like, what? That kayaker must be so grateful he lived, but so embarrassed that he tastes very bad. He lacks that delicious narwhal flavor. Then I read that Peppa Pig's mommy is pregnant, and I was like, what? Scandal! Who's the father? Oh, go ahead and get it, Mommy Pig. Now, you know what Daddy Pig is. Slow, chubby, and delicious. That this spring, Jeff Bezos is planning a celebrity space flight. And I was like, what? Then I read that Gayle King is gonna be aboard, and I was like, what? Gayle, do not do this. Then I found out it's an all-woman team, and I was like, what? In this social climate, you gonna let a bunch of men shoot you up into space on a rocket shaped like a boner? Have you lost your mind? Then I found out a rocket scientist named Aisha Bowe was also gonna go, and I was like, Aisha? Then I Googled her, and she is black. So now that I know that a black woman rocket scientist is involved, I'm fine with it. Then I saw that the White House kicked the Huffington Post out of their correspondence pool, and I was like, what? Then I saw that the White House took control of the correspondence pool, and I was like, what? This is bad news for whoever's gonna host the White House Correspondents' Dinner. Then I checked my email and was like, what? What? Musk asked federal employees to say what 5 things they accomplished at work last week, and I was like, what? A good idea. Hey, Seth, what did you accomplish at work last week?
Well, we were on hiatus, so nothing.
You are fired.
You're not my employer.
Because you're unemployed because I fired you.
You can't fire someone who doesn't work for you. I am sorry about that. We'll be right back with more.
But late night with Seth Meyers, you don't do it anymore. This desk smells like farts.
Come on.
We'll be right back.